There are stories that were never meant to be told aloud. Stories written in the dust between empires, where kings prayed and bled and vanished, and one quiet monk stayed behind to remember them. His name was Brother Matthieu de Clairmont. He watched the Crusades rise and fall, watched the world burn for heaven and find only ashes. But in those ashes, he found something brighter, the small, unbreakable mercy that outlives every sword. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll walk with him through forgotten cities. Hear the banners flutter, the prayers fade, and the sea whisper the names time erased. Because history doesn't sleep, it dreams. And in those dreams, the voices return. Welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, and to the Chronicle of Dust and Fire. The winter of the year 1095 hung like iron over the fields of Auvergne. Frost lay upon the roofs of Clermont, and breath rose like incense from a multitude gathered before the cathedral gates. There, beneath a pale sun, Pope Urban II lifted his hands, and the crowd became a single heart. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont stood among them, a slight figure in a travel-stained robe. He had come only to listen, to witness, perhaps to heal the sick who journeyed too far in the cold. Yet when the pontiff's voice thundered through the square, Deus vult, God wills it, the words entered Matthieu's soul as if they were not sound, but destiny itself. Around him, men wept and shouted, tearing cloth to stitch crimson crosses upon their shoulders. In that moment, Europe caught fire. The monk felt his knees weaken. Was this faith or fever? Could heaven truly command the spilling of blood? He looked toward the cathedral spire, its shadow drawn long upon the snow, and wondered whether the Almighty had spoken, or whether mankind had simply learned to echo its own hunger. Have you ever stood in a crowd and felt belief move through it like wind through dry grass? Have you heard a cry so vast that it drowned your own thoughts? That night, as fires burned along the river, Matthieu wrote the first line of his journal. I have heard the voice of God, and it sounded like men preparing for war. He did not yet know that this sentence would haunt him for 2 centuries. When dawn came, he joined a throng of knights, peasants, and priests who gathered supplies for a march none could imagine. The roads east were said to shine with promise, the Holy Sepulchre waiting like a jewel at the world's edge. Yet the air smelled of iron and dust. In the monastery stables, he bound wounds from men who had never seen battle, their hands trembling with the ecstasy of obedience. Faith had become a fever spreading faster than plague. The journey began with hymns. Pilgrims sang as they walked, voices rising through sleet, their feet bleeding upon frozen earth. Matthieu walked among them, his satchel filled with herbs and bandages, his heart divided between reverence and dread. Each village they passed rang its bells as if salvation itself were marching by, though some faces turned away, knowing what armies leave behind. At night, when campfires flickered against the snow, Matthieu listened to the stories, the merchants dreaming of spice and silk, the younger sons dreaming of crowns, the sinners dreaming of absolution bought with steel. Every man believed the same lie in a different tongue. Beneath their laughter, he heard the faintest echo of that voice from Clermont. God wills it. Did he? Or had they willed him? When he closed his eyes, he saw again the Pope's outstretched arms, the sea of faces lifted toward heaven, and the first spark of something that would burn continents. The voice had called them east, toward sand and sorrow, toward cities whose names they could not pronounce, toward history. And so Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, healer of the poor and keeper of quiet vows, set his feet upon the road to the Holy Land. Behind him, the bells of Clermont tolled the hour of vespers. Before him, 1,000 miles of dust waited to become scripture written in blood. The road east stretched like a wound through Christendom. From Burgundy's vineyards to the iron gates of Byzantium, the pilgrim host moved as a river of faith, glittering in the sun, festering in the rain. Among them walked Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, his sandals worn thin, his satchel heavy with herbs that wilted faster than hope. Each morning he rose before the horns, when mist still clung to the fields, and the air carried the sound of distant bells. He would tend to the sick, those who had mistaken zeal for strength, and whisper prayers above the dying. His Latin bled into the moans of fevered men, the syllables fraying like cloth torn too many times. He learned quickly that salvation had its own price in flesh. How many wounds can a holy cause endure before it begins to smell of rot? Villages emptied before the marching horde. Some peasants crossed themselves as the army passed. Others barred their doors. Children ran beside the columns, crying for bread. Matthieu watched knights throw scraps to them as if feeding dogs. The same hands that swore vows of mercy had grown hard beneath their gauntlets. The monk began to understand. Faith may start in heaven, but it must walk through earth to arrive there. And the earth is cruel. At night, they camped beneath a sky heavy with stars. Fires burned in circles, forming small constellations upon the ground. The soldiers sang psalms in voices hoarse with wine, their melodies dissolving into argument and laughter. Matthieu sat apart, copying what he saw into his parchment journal. He wrote not sermons but questions, sentences that trembled between belief and heresy. If God made us in his image, he wrote, then why do we sharpen our faces with iron and call the reflection holy? Have you ever walked toward a promise until it began to disappear the closer you came? Have you ever believed so fiercely that doubt itself became a kind of prayer? Weeks turned to months. The banners of the cross wilted under rain, their dye bleeding red against white linen, like old wounds reopening. Corpses marked the road in silence, pilgrims who could not keep pace, mothers clutching infants too weak to cry. Crows followed the army, black shadows wheeling above them like living omens. Matthieu began to bury more than he healed. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, incense, and decay. In the foothills of the Balkans, the Crusaders met famine. Grain stores were empty, rivers ran low. Men tore bark from trees and boiled their belts for broth. Still they pressed onward, driven by the echo of Clairmont, Deus Vult. Matthieu wondered whether God could hear them over the sound of so much hunger. When they reached the empire's western border, he saw the walls of Constantinople rise from the horizon like a mirage carved of marble and mist. The pilgrims fell to their knees, whispering that they had found the gate of heaven. But the Byzantine soldiers atop the ramparts looked down in silence, their faces hidden by helmets gilded in the dying sun. To them, the western host was no salvation, only another storm. That night, in the fields beyond the city, Matthieu met a Greek monk who offered him a cup of wine and spoke in quiet tones. "Brother, do you know what lies beyond these walls?" "Jerusalem," Matthieu answered. The monk shook his head. "No, beyond these walls lies hunger, betrayal, and the sea of sand. You will not find God there, only men pretending to be him." Matthieu did not reply. He watched the lanterns flicker upon the ramparts and thought of the voice that had begun all this. Perhaps it was not divine after all. Perhaps it was simply louder than his own conscience. As dawn broke, the host moved again, crossing into the empire whose aid they had promised to defend. The pilgrim road bent toward Asia Minor, toward mountains and deserts that waited like open graves. Behind them, the towers of Constantinople faded into smoke and distance. Before them, a continent of faith and fire stretched to the end of the world. Brother Matthieu walked in silence, the parchment of his journal pressed against his heart, the ink still damp from last night's confession. The wind carried the scent of salt and ash. Somewhere ahead, beyond 1,000 more miles of dust, men said the tomb of Christ awaited. But Matthieu already knew. The tombs he would find first would not be empty. By midsummer, the pilgrim host reached the city that called itself the Second Rome. Constantinople shimmered upon the Bosporus like a crown of glass, domes of beaten gold rising from a sea the color of wine. To men who had known only mud and frost, it seemed a vision carved from heaven. To Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, it was a warning. Beauty so perfect could not last beneath mortal hands. The crusading banners lined the fields beyond the walls, their silks snapping in the sea wind. Rumor traveled faster than prayer. The The Emperor Alexios Komnenos feared his allies. He had asked for knights to defend him from the Turks, and instead found an army that ate his granaries bare. Matthieu watched the Emperor's envoys ride out, men cloaked in purple, the faces unreadable behind veils of courtesy. They bowed with the stiffness of duty, bearing messages that meant both welcome and caution. That evening, under the light of 100 torches, Alexios himself appeared. He was no warrior saint, but a weary sovereign, silver showing at his temples, his gaze sharp as a blade kept too long in its sheath. His voice, when he spoke, carried the rhythm of command and exhaustion intertwined. "Tell your lords," he said, "that Rome still lives here. Aid us against the Turks, yes, but swear fealty first, lest this crusade become a conquest." The barons muttered, eyes narrowing above their cups. Oaths were chains, and each man already bore the weight of one shouted in France. But hunger and ambition whispered louder than conscience. The emperor promised ships, guides, gold. They knelt. Some meant it, most did not. Matthieu stood among the scribes recording their words, the quill trembling in his hand. He saw how easily vows turned to smoke. Have you ever witnessed truth dressed in silk, so polished that you mistook it for salvation? Have you ever signed your name to a promise you knew your heart would break? In the palace gardens, the monk wandered beneath cypress trees that smelled of myrrh and salt. A fountain murmured nearby, carved with angels whose eyes had been worn smooth by centuries of touch. There he met a servant girl drawing water. She asked him softly, "Why do your people come here, Father? Is there no God in your own lands?" He could not answer. The question followed him long after she vanished into the lantern-lit corridors. Days turned to weeks. The Crusaders feasted within the city's outer courts, while merchants counted the cost of hospitality. Silk changed hands, and relics gleamed in the markets like pieces of stolen heaven. Matthieu saw the West consume the East one bargain at a time. Faith had become a currency, holiness a rumor to be traded. When at last the army prepared to cross the straits, the emperor watched from his balcony, a shadow framed in torchlight. He raised his hand in blessing or farewell. No one could tell which. The horns sounded, echoing against marble and sea. Ships groaned beneath their cargo of men and hope. Matthieu stood at the prow of a vessel painted with a red cross. Behind him, Constantinople receded into mist, its domes fading like embers cooling in water. Ahead lay Asia, a continent of dust and promise. The monk opened his journal to a blank page and wrote, "The emperor fears his friends more than his enemies. Perhaps he is wiser than we." Night fell upon the Bosporus. The oars beat time like a dirge. Somewhere in the dark, a soldier began to sing a hymn, his voice cracking upon the high notes. Others joined until the sea itself seemed to breathe with them. Thousands of souls bound to one rhythm, moving toward a destiny none could name. Matthieu listened, his heart heavy with the sound. He imagined the emperor alone in his palace, praying not for victory but for delay. A little more time before faith devoured empire. The monk whispered a final prayer into the wind, not for triumph, but for mercy. The sea carried it away. The year of our Lord 1099 dawned with smoke upon the horizon. For 3 years the armies of the cross had clawed their way through hunger, plague, and desert, and now at last Jerusalem rose before them, its walls white beneath the furnace sun, its domes gleaming like the eyes of angels who had long ago turned away. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont stood upon a ridge of stone and dust, his lips cracked from thirst. He thought the city looked less like heaven than a wound that refused to close. Trumpets blared across the valley. Banners rippled crimson against the wind. The host knelt in the sand, and priests lifted relics toward the sky. Then came the cry that had haunted him since Clairmont. Deus Vult. Have you ever heard faith sound like thunder rolling through dry bones? Have you ever wondered whether God could still recognize his own voice after men have shouted it so long? The assault began at dawn. Siege towers groaned forward, wrapped in rawhide against the fire. Arrows darkened the air. Stones fell like rain. Matthieu moved among the wounded. binding flesh that burned hotter than the desert floor. Blood soaked the sand until it clung to his sandals like clay. He could smell it even when the wind changed. By noon, the ladders reached the walls. The first knights climbed, crosses sewn upon their tunics, catching the sun like sparks. From the battlements poured boiling oil, and screams rose that no psalm could drown. Yet the crusaders climbed still, shouting prayers through their own agony. Somewhere above, a banner of the cross unfurled in smoke, and the army roared. Jerusalem had fallen. Matthieu followed them through the gate when it broke. What he saw within the city would follow him for the rest of his days. The streets ran red. Horses slipped upon the blood of men, women, and children alike. Soldiers shouted blessings as they struck down anyone who moved. The clang of steel mingled with the chanting of Te Deum. Praise and slaughter braided together in one terrible harmony. Matthieu knelt beside a child whose eyes still searched for mercy and whispered the Lord's Prayer, though he no longer knew to whom he prayed. He entered the church of the Holy Sepulchre at twilight. The altar dripped with candle wax and blood alike. A knight knelt there, armor-stained, weeping as he kissed the stone that tradition named the tomb of Christ. "We have delivered it," the man murmured. Matthieu wanted to answer from what, but the words would not form. Outside, the sunset turned the city walls to gold, as if heaven mocked their triumph. The air reeked of smoke and sanctity. The monk sat upon a fallen step and opened his journal. The quill trembled in his hand. For what language could name holiness defiled? "We have conquered the city of God," he wrote, "and in doing so, we have slain him again." Night descended. The conquerors sang hymns upon the Temple Mount, their armor glimmering beneath the stars. Fires burned in every quarter, devouring wood, flesh, and memory. The wind carried the cries of the dying over the hills, like the echo of a broken liturgy. Matthieu listened until he could bear it no longer. He rose and wandered through the ruins toward the Garden of Gethsemane. There, among twisted olives, he knelt and pressed his hands into the soil. It was warm. He imagined the earth itself, remembering all the blood it had ever drunk. "Forgive us," he whispered, though he knew forgiveness would not come from heaven but from time, if at all. When the dawn came, Jerusalem lay quiet, its smoke rising straight into a pale sky. The victors proclaimed miracles. Relics were paraded through the streets. Banners blessed by popes fluttered from every tower. Yet beneath the bells, Brother Matthieu heard only the silence that follows sacrilege. Have you ever stood where you once dreamed heaven would open, and found only ash beneath your feet? He closed his journal and bound it with a strip of cloth torn from a dead man's sleeve. The first crusade was over. The kingdom of God on earth had begun, and already it stank of the grave. In the years that followed Jerusalem's conquest, the city forgot how to breathe. Its streets smelled of incense and iron, of sanctity and rot. Pilgrims arrived from the far ends of Christendom, eager to kiss the stones still dark with blood. Merchants followed, their scales clinking like rosaries. The new kingdom was christened in smoke and profit. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont remained within its walls, serving as healer in the hospital founded beside the Church of St. John. The brethren called themselves the Knights Hospitaller, warriors who tended wounds by day and opened them anew by night. Matthieu's hands learned both trades. He bound soldiers at dawn, and at dusk he watched them ride to kill in the name of the same cross stitched upon their bandages. Faith had become a wheel, turning from prayer to blood and back again. He kept a small cell near the hospice garden. From his window, he could see the Mount of Olives, its trees black against the desert light. Each evening, he wrote by the flicker of a single candle, the parchment filled with uneasy psalms, questions disguised as prayers. "We call this the kingdom of heaven," he wrote. "But heaven is built of stone and guarded by men who cannot sleep without a sword beside them." Have you ever touched something you once called sacred, only to feel how cold it truly is? Have you ever mistaken silence for peace, because the cries had simply grown too distant to hear? The lords quarreled over the spoils of sanctity. Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli. Each became a prize in the hands of men who spoke of salvation and meant territory. Coins bearing the image of the Holy Sepulchre filled the markets. Relics were sold like spices. Even fragments of the true passed from palm to palm for silver. The city that was meant to redeem the world had learned the art of selling forgiveness by weight. Sometimes, when the desert wind blew, Matthieu thought he heard voices crying beneath the stones, the ghosts of those who had died, so the living might bargain. He would walk the ramparts at dusk, watching the sand drift across the graves outside the gate, until the horizon swallowed the last light. In those hours, Jerusalem seemed less a city than a memory rehearsing its own death. Among the brethren there were rumors of a new threat rising from north, Turkish warlords gathering strength beyond the Euphrates. The knights spoke eagerly of battle, but Matthieu felt only weariness. He had tended too many wounds that never healed, seen too many men die convinced that holiness was measured in corpses. One evening a young hospitaller, barely 20, approached him in the infirmary. The boy's eyes were bright with zeal. "Brother," he asked, "do you believe the Lord dwells among us?" Matthieu looked at the rows of fevered soldiers, at the flies gathering upon the bandages, and said softly, "If he does, then he hides his face well." The boy crossed himself and fled. Truth, Matthieu had learned, was the one pain faith could not endure. The summer of drought came. Wells dried, and the smell of the dead returned. The monks prayed for rain, but none came. In the parched silence, Matthieu dreamt often of water, not the blessed Jordan, but the dark river that runs beneath all worlds, where the souls of the fallen drift without name. He would wake before dawn, his throat dry, whispering, "Deliver us from ourselves." When the first thunder finally rolled across the hills, he stepped into the courtyard. The rain fell black with dust, spattering the marble like ink upon a manuscript. He lifted his hands and felt it sting his skin. It was not cleansing, only reminder. The city drank greedily, gutters running red from the rooftops, as if even the sky had remembered the blood beneath its stones. That night Matthieu wrote by the dying candlelight, "The kingdom of heaven has walls. Within them dwell men who believe they have found eternity. But outside, in the storm, perhaps God still wanders, seeking those who have forgotten him." He closed the journal, and the candle hissed out. Darkness filled the room, like smoke rising from an altar long since cold. Have you ever prayed for morning, and feared it might come? Stone by stone, the kingdom of heaven became a fortress. The pilgrims had come to worship, but the conquerors built to endure. Along the coast, towers rose like thorns, their battlements cutting into the blue of the sky. At Antioch, at Tripoli, at the edge of every desert road, new walls took shape under the sun, Norman, Frankish, Italian, each bearing the cross as both banner and warning. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont walked among the builders, the dust clinging to his robe, the smell of mortar thick in the air. He heard the clang of hammers echo like church bells, summoning not to prayer but to permanence. The Crusaders believed they were founding eternity, yet the stones themselves seemed to groan beneath the weight of such pride. At the fortress of Croc, he tended masons whose hands bled from cutting limestone. They worked by torchlight, singing psalms as they raised towers that would one day be graves. Matthieu bound their wounds and listened. Faith had become masonry, measured not by hearts converted, but by walls completed. "Is this what salvation looks like?" he whispered to himself. "Have you ever built something so strong that it imprisoned you inside it?" By the second decade of conquest, Jerusalem's kings ruled an empire of dust and silence. Baldwin, crowned with both hope and illness, presided from chambers perfumed with incense to hide the smell of death. The leper king, his flesh crumbling even as he blessed his nobles, was a mirror of the realm itself, beautiful, decaying, held together by faith and fear in equal measure. Matthieu served as a scribe for a season. In that palace of marble and bone, he recorded decrees, copied letters to Rome, and watched the royal physicians grind herbs into potions that could not cure the corruption beneath the skin. The king smiled through pain, his voice thin but resolute. "If God wills my flesh to fall," Baldwin once said, "then let him find me still seated upon his throne." The monk bowed, though he wondered what throne heaven had ever desired in this place. Outside the city, the desert stretched like a sea of forgotten prayers. The new castles glittered at its edges, their banners snapping in a wind that smelled of sand and memory. Matthieu rode between them often, carrying messages for the Hospitallers. He came to know the taste of solitude, the way silence could hum like a psalm too low for words. Sometimes he would climb to the highest tower and look westward. The sun sank behind the hills, and he would imagine France somewhere beyond the burning horizon, a world of green pastures and simple altars. He tried to recall the voice of his abbot, the sound of morning bells at Clairmont, but memory had grown thin as parchment. The east had swallowed him whole. In the fortress courtyard, children of both Frank and Syrian blood played with wooden swords. Their laughter rose over the chanting of soldiers drilling at dawn. The mingling of tongues fascinated Matthieu. He saw how easily faith could learn another accent, how swiftly conquest bred a new people neither wholly east nor west. Perhaps, he thought, this was what God had meant, to fuse, not to divide. But every fusion leaves a scar. When winter came, he fell ill with fever and lay for weeks between waking and dream. In his visions, the castles sank back into the earth, their towers dissolving into dunes. He saw knights praying with no mouths, their crosses buried beneath the sand, and above them, the leper king walking barefoot through the ruins, his flesh made whole again, whispering, "We were dust, and we built dust." He awoke with the taste of blood on his tongue. The fever broke, but the dream stayed. That spring, news arrived that Edessa had fallen, a Christian city devoured by its own isolation. The Turks had come in the night, swift and silent, like the hand of a forgotten god reclaiming his land. The courtyards filled with mourning. The walls trembled beneath the sound of prayers offered too late. Matthieu wrote in his chronicle that evening, "Our fortresses are strong, yet the faith that binds them is brittle. Stone cannot outlast doubt." He closed the book, feeling the grit of dust between its pages, the same dust that would one day fill his lungs. Beyond the ramparts, the desert wind rose, carrying faint echoes of chanting from the distant mosques. The voices mingled with the tolling of the chapel bell, two prayers meeting in the dark. For a heartbeat, Matthieu thought they harmonized. Then the wind shifted, and the harmony was gone. Have you ever heard two truths sing at once, only to realize they were mourning the same thing? The year the North went silent, the rumor of ruin arrived before the messengers. From Edessa came whispers carried by traders, gates broken in the night, churches drowned in flame, towers stripped of their crosses and crowned with crescent moons. The name upon every tongue was Zengi, at first spoken as a curse, then as a storm. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont heard it first in the courtyard of the hospice. A pilgrim stumbled in from the desert, his robe crusted with dust and salt. He fell before the altar and gasped, "Edessa is gone." No one believed him until the next caravan arrived bearing proof. Banners torn from her battlements, fragments of icons blackened by smoke. The first Crusader city had fallen, and the echo of its death rattled every heart from Antioch to Jerusalem. Matthieu watched the nobles gather in the palace hall, their armor polished bright to hide their fear. They spoke of vengeance, of banners and glory, of riding north at once. Yet their voices faltered when they looked upon the maps, the wide emptiness between their walls and the enemy's strength. The kingdom that called itself holy was suddenly very small. Outside, the people prayed louder. Processions wound through the streets, relics lifted high as if they could deflect disaster by sheer weight of silver. The monks sang Kyrie eleison until their throats bled. Matthieu joined them, but the words fell hollow. Have you ever prayed because silence frightened you more than unbelief? In his journal he wrote, "We have learned the art of walls, but not the art of peace. The Lord we invoke no longer answers. Perhaps he listens elsewhere." Weeks later, a council met in the refectory of Saint Anne. Messengers from the north laid the blame upon one another, on negligence, on treachery, on God's inscrutable will. The talk drifted toward Europe, toward pleas for new aid. Another crusade, they said, another cleansing fire. Matthieu thought of Clairmont, of that first cry rising like wind through dry grass. The same words would soon be shouted again. History was a wheel. Every turn crushed what lay beneath. That night he walked the ramparts. From the walls he could see the desert flicker with distant fires, not enemy beacons, but the camps of refugees. Families who had fled Edessa wandered south, bringing tales of slaughter and despair. Matthieu descended to meet them. He found a mother cradling a child whose eyes stared but did not see. She said softly, "They burned the church while we were still inside." He had no words to offer, only water. The fall of Edessa changed everything. The merchants hoarded their goods. The knights argued over whose turn it was to die for God. And the priests whispered that heaven demanded greater sacrifice. Soon, preachers arrived from the west, men whose voices shook like trumpets. They promised salvation reborn, armies greater than before, the washing away of shame. The people cheered, the coin chests opened. Matthieu felt the chill of memory crawl along his spine. In the quiet hours, he sat by the infirmary lamps, copying a new psalter for the chapel. His hand trembled not from age, but from dread. He had seen too much of redemption purchased in blood. He dipped a quill and wrote a line that was not scripture. When faith becomes hunger, it devours even the hand that feeds it. Have you ever known a moment when hope itself began to smell of smoke? By midsummer, riders brought word that armies were indeed coming, kings, princes, and priests marching east to erase humiliation. The Second Crusade had been born from the ashes of the first. Matthieu closed his journal and whispered, "So the wheel turns again." In his dream that night, he stood upon the ramparts of a city built from salt. Below, the sands moved like waves, and from them rose towers of glass that melted as they touched the sky. Voices cried his name, and among them he heard one he had not heard since Clairmont. A voice that once sounded divine. Now it was weary, human, and full of regret. "Did you think faith would end in victory?" it asked. He woke before dawn, the echo still in his ears. When the bells of Jerusalem rang for morning prayer, Matthieu knelt among the brothers. He bowed his head, but his thoughts were far to the north, where Edessa lay in ruin, her stones scattered like beads from a broken rosary. He whispered the only prayer he still remembered. "Lord, if you are still watching, teach us how to lose with grace." The sun rose blood-red over the desert. Shadows of new armies stretched across the land, long and hungry. The kingdom built of dust prepared once more to meet the wind. Across the cathedrals of Europe, bells tolled like warnings from the edge of the world. The fall of Edessa had become more than rumor. It had become a wound in Christendom's heart. In cloisters and taverns alike, men spoke of vengeance with trembling voices, and from that trembling rose a single sound, the voice of a preacher whose words burned brighter than reason. Bernard of Clairvaux. He moved through the kingdoms like a torch through dry wheat, his sermons fanning sparks into storm. Wherever he stood, in the squares of Burgundy, the marketplaces of Cologne, the halls of France, crowds gathered until the very air seemed to breathe his name. His voice was thin but sharp as light through stained glass. "God calls you once more," he cried. "The blood of martyrs cries from the dust. The holy city awaits its deliverance." And men wept. Women tore linen for crosses. The old blessed their sons, and the young blessed their swords. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont stood among the listeners at Vézelay, though he had come only as a pilgrim seeking herbs for the hospice. He watched Bernard ascend a wooden platform, the spring sun gilding the preacher's white robe until it seemed to flame. Around him, thousands fell to their knees. Some fainted outright, their bodies convulsing with a joy that looked like pain. The monk felt the heat of it, and it frightened him. Have you ever felt belief moving through a crowd like fever through the veins? A warmth that consumes rather than comforts? Bernard spoke of sin and glory, of the promise of heaven for those who took the cross anew. Yet beneath the holy cadence, Matthieu heard another rhythm. Hunger, envy, despair. The same music that had driven the first Crusaders eastward decades ago. The melody had changed, but the dance remained the same. When the sermon ended, Bernard raised a wooden cross high above the multitude. "Who will bear this burden for Christ?" he called. Hands shot up like flames in a field, and before Matthieu could move or breathe, someone had pressed a symbol against his chest. The wood was warm from another man's grasp. He felt it burn through the cloth, as if the fire itself had chosen him. He walked away with it still clutched in his palm, the smell of incense and sweat thick in the air. That night he wrote in his journal, "The preacher's voice is holy, but his echo leads men toward a familiar abyss. The second fire has been lit, and the wind is rising." Within months, the new crusade gathered its might. Kings pledged banners, Conrad of Germany, Louis of France. Monks blessed the forges, where fresh swords gleamed like mirrors of unspoken sin. Even children were caught by the fever, drawing crosses on their arms with soot. To refuse was to confess cowardice before God. Matthieu remained with the Hospitallers as healers prepared for war once more. He saw the young knights polishing armor that had already known too much blood, their faces shining with the light of imagined salvation. He could not tell whether they looked more like angels or executioners. Before they departed, he visited a small chapel outside the walls. There, before an icon blackened with age, he prayed not for victory but for clarity. The candlelight wavered, casting long shadows that crossed like bars of a cell. "If you speak through these men, Lord," he whispered, "then teach me to hear you without burning." The next morning, the host marched east again, banners snapping against the sky, hymns rising like thunder. Matthieu walked among them, his healer's bag at his side, the cross of red cloth sewn once more upon his robe. It felt heavier than before. At each village they passed, peasants lined the roads. Some begged blessings, others spat at the soldiers' boots. The memory of the First Crusade's devastation had not faded from the land. Still, the tide of faith rolled on. The preacher's fire had done its work. As the army crossed the Rhine, snow began to fall. It melted upon the helmets like tears. Matthieu paused at the river's edge and watched the waters carry flakes downstream, each one vanishing without trace. He thought of Edessa, of the burned churches, and the child who no longer saw. The wind off the water smelled of iron. He opened his journal and wrote a single line. "Every flame believes it gives light, until it touches flesh." Have you ever mistaken heat for holiness? Have you ever seen men love God so fiercely that they could not see the smoke rising from their own hands? Matthieu closed the book and walked on, the banners ahead flickering crimson against the white of winter. The preacher's voice was behind them now, but its fire still burned, unseen, unquenchable, waiting to consume the world once more. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath them. 2 crowns, 2 armies, 2 worlds of pride and prayer set forth beneath the same heaven. King Louis of France rode at the head of one host, his Queen Eleanor beside him, her veil gleaming like a banner of ivory. From the north came Emperor Conrad of Germany, his knights armored in iron that caught the sun like a wall of mirrors. Between them stretched a continent that had forgotten silence. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont marched with the healers at the rear, the dust of thousands of hooves clinging to his robe until it turned the color of old parchment. He wrote in his heart what his quill could not record. The rhythm of sandals, the creak of wagons, the weary hymns muttered through cracked lips. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and expectation, a pilgrimage that had mistaken itself for destiny. The German banners reached Byzantium first. Conrad's men filled the valleys like a tide of steel, their discipline fraying beneath hunger and pride. The emperor's envoys demanded tribute, passage, and honor. The Greeks answered with walls and wary smiles. In the palace, Emperor Manuel watched from high windows, his jeweled fingers tapping the marble sill. He had seen such men before, devout and dangerous. He offered guides, supplies, oaths of alliance. but his courtiers whispered that wolves had entered the garden. The Byzantines lit lanterns along the walls not to welcome, but to measure how close the fire might come. Matthieu witnessed the first quarrels break out over bread. A German knight struck a merchant who refused to sell grain. The man fell, and the crowd trampled him before realizing he was already dead. The monk bound the knight's hand where his own sword had cut him. "You are wounded," Matthieu said softly. "For God," the knight replied. "For God." His voice trembled. It did not sound like faith, only fatigue. When the armies moved east into Anatolia, the land turned cruel. Hills folded into endless ridges, the sky a white furnace. Turkish horsemen shadowed them like hawks, their arrows falling from invisible hands. Conrad's army dwindled by the day. Thirst took more souls than steel. The corpses of pack animals marked the road like milestones. The emperor himself was struck by fever and carried on a litter, his crown hidden beneath rags to disguise his weakness. Louis arrived weeks later to find only wreckage, shields half buried in sand, the smell of decay thick in the wind. The survivors spoke of ambush, of treachery, of God's anger. Matthieu knelt among them, pressing linen to wounds that would never close. He felt their pulses fade beneath his fingers and wondered which hurt worse, to die unbelieving or to live uncertain. Have you ever seen an army pray with its eyes open, not to praise, but to plead? Eleanor rode through the camp, her presence a flicker of grace amid ruin. Some whispered she was a blessing, others called her a distraction. She moved like a queen from a legend, fearless, restless, aware that the songs already forming about her would outlive the men dying in her shadow. Louis watched her and said nothing. Their marriage, like the crusade itself, had become a weary procession bound together by duty and distance. At Ephesus, the two kings met at last. Their hands clasped in front of the altar, but their eyes avoided one another. Conrad's voice was hollow from sickness, Louis's from doubt. They spoke of unity, of Jerusalem, of God's will. Yet both knew that faith had split itself in two, each half too proud to kneel before the other. Matthieu listened from the doorway. He thought of Bernard's sermon, of the fire that had kindled this march. Now he saw only smoke. The armies pressed onward toward the Holy Land, staggering through the same deserts that had swallowed generations before them. Men deserted in the night, leaving their crosses carved into the sand like apologies. Fever swept the camps. The healers ran out of balm and prayer alike. Matthieu sat beside a dying squire who whispered, "Brother, tell me what heaven looks like." The monk brushed the boy's hair from his eyes. "I do not know," he said, "but I think it is quieter than this." When at last they reached Antioch, half the banners were gone. The survivors cheered anyway, their joy ringing hollow against the stones. Letters were sent to Jerusalem begging food, ships, allies, anything. In reply came silence, and the steady wind from the south that smelled faintly of the sea and decay. That night Matthieu wrote by the light of a single candle. Two kings marched east seeking paradise. They found only themselves, and that was punishment enough. Have you ever followed a light so far that, when it went out, you could no longer remember the way home? By midsummer the air itself had begun to shimmer, thick with dust and doubt. The armies of France and Germany, bound now by exhaustion more than faith, reached the gardens of Damascus, a city said to be older than Eden. Its walls glowed pale under the merciless sun, and beyond them orchards bloomed with figs and pomegranates. The scent of fruit carried across the dry wind like mockery. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont stood among the healers on the southern plain, his robe stiff with sweat and sand. He had imagined Damascus as the heart of the infidel world, dark, defiant, unholy. But as he looked upon its shaded groves, its domes glinting like bronze under the light, he felt a strange reverence. Could holiness be divided by language, by the way one faced the dawn in prayer? The trumpets sounded at first light. The cross banners advanced behind great wooden towers, dragged by oxen, their wheels carving trenches into the dust. Arrows hissed like locusts. The orchards that had once promised shade turned to labyrinths of death. Each tree hid archers, whose shafts fell silent and sudden. By noon, the ground was strewn with the fallen, soldiers tangled among shattered branches, the air sweet with fruit and blood. Matthieu moved from one broken body to another, his hands trembling. He pressed cloth to wounds that could not be bound and whispered prayers that no longer sounded sincere. The heat warped the horizon until the city itself seemed to waver, like a vision of heaven just out of reach, or hell approaching unseen. By evening, the commanders argued beneath their standards. The French demanded to attack the western wall. The Germans swore that God favored the east. Maps were drawn, then torn. Spies whispered of betrayal, of Byzantine guides leading them astray, of hidden treaties between Damascus and Jerusalem. The crusade, born in unity, began to gnaw upon itself. Matthieu sat apart, his hands stained crimson. He remembered Bernard's sermon, the roar of the crowd at Vézelay, and wondered if the preacher had foreseen this, faith melting beneath the desert sun. Have you ever believed so fiercely that the truth, when it came, felt like blasphemy? On the third day, the attack turned inward. Orders were contradicted. Supplies vanished. Banners fell to confusion. The orchards burned, and smoke rolled across the fields in thick gray veils. Under that shroud, men of the same cross turned their swords upon one another in the dark. The Turks, watching from the city walls, did not need to fight. They simply waited. At dawn, the trumpets called retreat, not to Jerusalem, but back toward shame. The banners of two kings drooped like wilted flowers. Louis rode in silence, his face gray with dust and defeat. Conrad's army had already begun its slow death march north. The crusade that had once promised redemption left behind only ashes and rumor. That night Matthieu found himself alone beside a dried stream bed. He knelt and scooped a handful of dust, letting it fall through his fingers. "So this is what we came to make holy," he whispered. In the distance, he could hear the faint bells of Damascus. Their tone was soft, mournful, almost kind. He realized they sounded like forgiveness, not the kind that comes from heaven, but the kind the defeated give themselves when they have no strength left to hate. He returned to the camp where the wounded lay in rows beneath the fading stars. Many no longer breathed. He covered their faces with linen, murmuring the words of burial. When he reached the last body, he hesitated. It was a boy no older than 15, the cross of red cloth still stitched over his heart. Beneath the symbol, Matthieu could see the wound that had opened it. He closed his eyes and prayed in silence. For the boy, for himself, for the city that had survived them all. In his journal, he wrote by moonlight, "We came to Damascus, seeking the glory of God. We found only the reflection of our own hunger, bright and terrible as the desert sun." Have you ever realized too late that you were praying to your own shadow? When dawn rose, the crusaders were already gone. The smoke from the orchards drifted toward the horizon, and with it, the sound of fading hymns. Damascus stood untouched behind its walls, its gardens still green, its fountains still singing. The city had endured, not by the sword, but by patience. It had watched holiness consume itself, and learned that silence can be the truest form of victory. The road away from Damascus shimmered like a mirror of regret. Dust hung in the air for days, veiling the retreating army in a pale haze that smelled of metal and shame. Men trudged in silence, too tired to curse, too proud to weep. Among the weary banners moved Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, her palfrey draped in crimson silk torn and dulled by sand. She rode slightly apart from her husband, the king, as if the distance between their horses measured the distance between their souls. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont followed with the healers, watching how the queen's shadow fell longer each evening, a dark streak stretching across the baked earth. Rumors whispered through the ranks like flies around the dead, that Eleanor had quarreled with Louis, that she had questioned his faith, that she had spoken aloud what others only feared, that God had turned away. One night, camped near a grove of olive trees, Matthieu brought water to the royal tents. He paused outside, hearing voices. Louis prayed aloud, his tone harsh and hurried, as if trying to remind heaven of promises made long ago. Eleanor's voice answered, low, steady, and sharp as a blade drawn in the dark. "You think holiness means obedience," she said. "Perhaps it means seeing clearly, even when the light offends the eyes." When Matthieu entered, Louis fell silent. The queen turned toward him, and in the flicker of lamplight he saw not defiance, but weariness so deep it looked like wisdom. She took the cup from his trembling hands. "Tell me, brother," she said softly, "when men kill for heaven, who listens to their prayers?" Matthieu had no answer. He bowed and left, the sound of the cup setting down, echoing like a bell. Have you ever met someone whose doubts sounded holier than your own faith? The next days blurred together, heat by day, cold by night. Endless sand and murmured discontent. Knights quarreled over routes, priests argued over omens, and in every quarrel Matthieu heard the slow unraveling of the crusade soul. Yet around the queen gathered a different quiet, an island of calm thought amid the clamor. She spoke little, but when she did, men listened. Perhaps they mistook her calm for prophecy, or perhaps they were simply drawn to a voice that did not shout. One evening she rode beside Matthieu as the column wound through a valley streaked with thornbush. "Brother," she asked, "you have seen many deaths. Do you still believe they mean something?" He hesitated. "Meaning may be the only thing we give them, my lady." She nodded, eyes on the dark horizon. "Then may God forgive us for giving them so much." Behind them, the sun bled into the hills, red light spilling like wine over stone. To Matthieu it looked like the world itself was confessing. At Atalia the crusade split apart. Conrad turned north to nurse his wounds and his pride. Louis led what remained toward the coast. Ships waited to carry them back, but not all would sail. Some died on the shore, too weak to reach the water. Others vanished into the bazaars, shedding crosses for coin. The dream that had set out from France with 1,000 hymns ended here in whispers and fever. Eleanor boarded her vessel last. Matthieu saw her pause at the gangplank, gaze lingering on the eastern hills where the light was fading. "Tell them in France," she said to no one in particular, "that the Holy Land is not lost. It was never found." Then she stepped aboard, her shadow dissolving into the sea's reflection. When the sails filled with wind, Matthieu remained on the pier until the ships were specks of white against the horizon. The surf hissed around his ankles like a voice he could almost understand. He opened his journal and wrote, "The Queen sails west, the King prays for pardon, and the preacher's fire has burned itself to ash. Perhaps holiness was never in the stone city, but in the mercy we denied each other." Have you ever watched faith depart like a ship, knowing it would never return the same? That night, the monk lay beneath a foreign sky. Stars scattered across the dark, like remnants of some shattered promise. He traced their patterns, naming them after the places and faces already gone. Edessa, Conrad, the nameless boy, and at last Eleanor. Her name lingered longest, because in her defiance he had glimpsed something truer than obedience. The courage to question heaven itself. As dawn crept over the coast, the first gulls cried. Matthieu rose, his robe heavy with dew, and turned east once more, not toward conquest, but toward understanding. The crusade had failed, but its echo would follow him, a prayer without language, a shadow that never left his side. The years that followed smelled of dust and rebuilding. Europe retreated into its own wounds, while in the lands it had tried to conquer, something new began to breathe. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, older now and thinner, wandered through the eastern provinces in silence, sometimes as healer, sometimes as scribe, always as witness. He had come seeking penance. Instead, he found history awakening beneath his feet. Cairo shimmered before him like a mirage made real, a city of light and noise, markets spilling into alleys, where incense curled above spices and silk. Here, no banners of the cross flew, only the green standards of Islam, the murmur of prayers that rose and fell like the sea. And amid this tide of faith moved one man whose name was beginning to ripple through the world, Yusuf ibn Ayyub Saladin. At first, Matthieu heard the name whispered in the bazaars, spoken with both fear and reverence. The son of a Kurdish officer serving under Nur al-Din, he was said to possess the mind of a scholar and the patience of a saint. Yet his eyes, they said, were the eyes of a hawk, always searching, never still. In a time when empires crumbled faster than temples, that gaze began to gather purpose. Matthieu met him once, by accident, or by fate. He had entered a caravanserai to tend a wounded guard, and found the new commander sitting cross-legged on a rug of faded red. Saladin looked up, his expression calm, curious. "You are Frank," he said, not as accusation but as observation. "I was," Matthieu answered. "Now I am only a man who remembers too much." The Sultan smiled faintly. "Then you and I share a burden. I, too, remember what others forget." They spoke little more, yet Matthieu carried that meeting with him like a small flame in the dark. There was no arrogance in the Kurdish general, only gravity, as if he already bore the weight of things yet to come. Have you ever met someone whose silence felt heavier than another man's armies? Under Nur al-Din's command, Saladin learned the art of restraint. He watched how power collapsed when guided by vengeance alone. He studied the mistakes of both sides, the greed of Christian kings, the pride of emirs who fought each other more than their enemies. And when Nur al-Din died, leaving Syria fragile and divided, Saladin did what few expected. He waited. Patience became his sword. While others raced to seize cities, he built trust. While rivals plotted, he wrote letters of mercy. By the time Matthieu returned to Damascus, years later, the banners of Egypt and Syria had united beneath the same crescent. The world that had once trembled before the cross now looked east and whispered a new name, Sultan of Islam. Matthieu watched from the edge of a courtyard as scholars, soldiers, and merchants gathered around Saladin. The Sultan's words were measured, never boastful. "War," he said, "is not holiness, it is hunger. If it must be done, let it feed something greater than pride." The listeners nodded, but Matthieu felt the unspoken truth. The same hunger that had devoured Europe now lived here, gentler in voice but equal in power. Outside, Damascus bloomed again, gardens replanted, fountains rebuilt. The muezzin's call rose each evening like a lullaby, and for the first time in years, Matthieu slept without dreams. Yet in the morning, he woke to rumors of armies mustering beyond the horizon. Jerusalem was still a wound that neither side could ignore. He spent his days in hospitals founded by the Sultan himself, places where wounded Franks and Muslims lay side by side. He learned that mercy, when practiced daily, became its own kind of crusade. Sometimes, while washing blood from bandages, he wondered if Saladin's calm was truly peace, or only the stillness before another storm. Have you ever sensed history holding its breath, waiting for the next shout? One evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the city, Matthieu climbed the citadel walls and looked toward the west. The sun sank red behind the hills, gilding the minarets in fire. He thought of Louis, of Eleanor, of Bernard's voice breaking the sky. All of it now seemed like a dream fading at dawn, yet the air carried a strange certainty that the story was not ending, only turning its face. He wrote by the fading light. In the west, faith burns men alive. In the east, it shapes them into stone. Both call their labor holy. Perhaps holiness is simply endurance. Below, the city hummed with life, the pulse of an empire rising not by miracle, but by discipline and patience. And far beyond the walls, unseen yet inevitable, the dust of armies began once more to rise. For Jerusalem waited still, quiet beneath the moon, as if listening for the footsteps of the man who would one day reclaim it. Cairo at dawn glowed gold, as if God himself had brushed the city with light. Minarets shimmered above the Nile, and prayer rose from rooftops like mist. In the palace courtyard, soldiers drilled in silence, while scribes waited with scrolls already heavy with history. Upon a marble terrace, Saladin stood, not in armor, but in plain white cloth, watching the river bend toward the sea. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont had been summoned to the court as a translator. He came barefoot across cool stone, carrying the weariness of a man who no longer knew which side of holiness he belonged to. The Sultan greeted him not as servant nor enemy, but as guest. "Sit, brother," he said in Arabic soft as sand through fingers. "Tell me how your people pray for peace, yet come to us with swords." Matthieu lowered his eyes. "We confuse conquest for redemption, Majesty. Perhaps we thought they were the same." Saladin smiled faintly. "They are not. One feeds the earth with blood, the other feeds the heart with patience." He turned back to the horizon, where the first ships of his Egyptian fleet glided across the Nile, like dark petals. "Egypt is a garden too long neglected," he said. "Now it must be tended, not only with strength, but with wisdom." And so his reign began, not with thunder, but with irrigation. He rebuilt canals where others had raised armies, restored markets before raising taxes, and sent envoys rather than executioners. Matthieu followed the court as chronicler, watching villages come alive with trade and laughter. Grain flowed north, gold flowed south. For a fleeting moment, it seemed a man of faith could heal what centuries of zeal had scarred. But peace, like fruit, attracts flies. In the alleys of Cairo, whispers grew that Saladin's mercy was weakness, that his tolerance toward Christians and Jews betrayed the warriors who had followed him from Syria. Matthieu heard the murmurs while treating the sick in the city's hospital, a sanctuary the Sultan himself had ordered built. The healers there wore no crosses, no crescents, only clean hands. When he told Saladin of the unrest, the ruler only nodded. "Mercy," he said, "is sharper than the sword, but it cuts the man who wields it first." Have you ever tried to hold peace so tightly that it begins to bleed between your fingers? Months passed. Letters arrived from the north, reports of rival emirs plotting rebellion, of Jerusalem's kings sharpening new ambitions. The Sultan's advisors urged war. Saladin listened in silence, then dismissed them all. Only Matthieu remained. "You once served kings who prayed for glory," the Sultan said. "Tell me, does God love the conqueror or the survivor?" "I think," Matthieu answered, "he loves whoever still listens after the battle ends." The Sultan smiled. "Then pray that I may listen longer than they can shout." Yet even patience has a limit. When word came that Christian ships had raided Muslim ports in the Red Sea, killing pilgrims bound for Mecca, the Sultan's calm cracked. For the first time, Matthieu saw anger in his eyes, cold, not wild. "Mercy," Saladin murmured, "must rest, lest it become mockery." The campaign that followed swept through the Nile Delta like floodwater. Rebel cities were surrounded, their walls battered down not in rage, but in methodical inevitability. When they surrendered, the Sultan spared their lives, but stripped their pride. He made them rebuild what they had destroyed. "Punishment," he said to Matthieu, "should teach, not please." By night, he dreamed, or so his scribes claimed, of Jerusalem, a city of stone and silence, glimmering always just beyond his reach. In those dreams, the prophet stood upon the Temple Mount, his face veiled in light, whispering a single word, "Wait," and Saladin woke trembling, for he understood that waiting might be the hardest form of obedience. One evening, Matthieu found him alone by the palace garden. The Sultan's hands were clasped behind his back, his gaze lost among the palm trees, swaying against the dusk. "Tell me, brother," he said quietly, "what remains of faith when all enemies are gone?" Matthieu thought for a long time. "Perhaps," he said, "faith is what survives even when victory has no meaning." Saladin nodded slowly, his eyes distant, seeing something neither of them could yet name. Then he said, almost to himself, "Then may God grant me both victory and the wisdom to outlive it." Matthieu wrote those words in his journal that night. Outside, the Nile murmured under the moon, a sound as old as prayer itself. He wondered whether peace could ever last longer than the silence between wars. Have you ever watched a man become legend before your eyes? Not because he conquered, but because he waited? The summer air above Damascus shimmered with heat and prophecy. For years, Saladin had built his realm not from conquest, but from patience. Now patience itself had become a weapon, sharpened by memory, tempered by loss. The crescent banners of Egypt and Syria flew side by side for the first time in generations, their green silk whispering unity. And from the west came news that the kings of Christendom were stirring again, restless as lions denied their prey. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont watched preparations unfold like the slow tightening of a bowstring. He had grown old among these people, his beard silver now, his robes faded. He no longer felt like a Frank among Saracens, but a witness standing between two tides that had forgotten why they rose. He had tended too many wounds to care who struck the blow, and yet, even he could feel the pulse of inevitability quicken. Jerusalem had become the word no one dared to speak aloud. Its name hung in the air like incense, sweet, choking, and holy. The Sultan spoke little of it, but everyone around him knew. The dream he had kept folded in silence was beginning to unfold. From the citadel walls, Matthieu watched as envoys came and went. Aleppo, Mosul, Cairo, all carrying the same message. The time of division was over. The time of reckoning had come. Have you ever felt history breathe against your neck, whispering that the next sunrise will change everything? At court, Saladin remained calm. He studied maps drawn on lambskin, his finger tracing routes that curved like rivers of destiny. War is not hatred, he told his generals. It is mathematics written in blood. If it must be done, let us write cleanly. Yet at night alone, Matthieu saw him walking the corridors long after the candles burned low, as if searching for something he could not name, a silence deep enough to pray inside. When the army assembled, its banners stretched to the horizon. Tens of thousands of men, Syrians, Kurds, Egyptians, Arabs, once rivals, now brothers under one commander. They moved like a single creature across the desert, shimmering beneath the sun, their spears glinting like scales. The air hummed with psalms and hoofbeats. Matthieu rode with the rear guard, tending to the sick and fainting. He saw faces filled not with hatred, but with a strange, resigned calm. Men who believed they were walking toward prophecy, not battle. He wondered if faith was simply another form of sleepwalking. As they neared the frontier of the Latin kingdoms, scouts brought reports of fortified towns trembling behind their walls. But Saladin forbade slaughter. Each drop of blood we spill must serve a purpose, he said. If God wishes us to cleanse, he will send rain, not fire. Still fire came. In small border skirmishes, knights rode out from Christian outposts, reckless, shining like ghosts from another age. They struck fast and died faster. Their armor melted under the desert sun. Their horses fell screaming. Matthieu tended the wounded from both sides. Once, a Frankish soldier dying in his arms whispered in his own tongue, "Brother, is this still holy?" Matthieu could only weep, because the man's accent was from Normandy, his own home. Two pilgrims lost on opposite roads. By spring, the armies faced each other across the plain of Hattin, a ridge of black basalt rising like the spine of some sleeping god. Below it, the Christian camp shimmered in heat, their banners heavy, their waterskins light. Saladin's forces encircled them, silent as wind before thunder. The crescent and the cross stared at one another beneath a white, pitiless sun. That night, Matthieu knelt beside Saladin's tent. Inside, the Sultan prayed alone, his voice low, steady, unwavering. When he emerged, his eyes were clear as polished stone. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "the world remembers who it belongs to." "Majesty," Matthieu asked, "and afterward?" Saladin paused. "Afterward, the victors will forget why they fought, and the defeated will remember forever. Have you ever known a dawn that felt like judgment itself? At sunrise, the horns sounded, the desert filled with movement, banners unfurling, drums rolling like distant thunder. Matthieu felt the vibration through his bones, through the sand. through the centuries. He knew he was standing inside the hinge of time, the moment where mercy and wrath changed faces. He whispered a prayer he no longer understood, as the two great faiths charged toward one another, and the sky filled with dust so thick it turned noon to twilight. That was the day the lion met the crescent, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The morning rose red, and the wind carried the smell of burning grass. From the ridge of Atene the sun glared like an unblinking eye, turning the battlefield into a furnace. Below it stretched two oceans, one of banners, one of dust. The Crusaders' camp shimmered in heat haze. The army of Islam surrounded it in a vast, silent crescent. Between them lay the dry valley, where prophecy waited. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont felt the air itself tighten. He had seen men march into battle before, but never like this. Never with the weariness of souls who had already lost everything but duty. He knelt beside a wounded horse, pressing cool cloth to its muzzle, whispering, "Drink, friend, before the world burns." The water he offered was the last in his flask. Saladin rode among his lines, a calm presence amid the shimmer of steel. He spoke few words, yet every soldier who saw him straightened as if steadied by invisible hands. "Patience," he said. "Let the sun fight for us." And it did. The Christian host had been drawn from their wells the day before, lured across miles of wasteland by promise and pride. Now their throats cracked with thirst. The very air seemed to drink them dry. King Guy of Jerusalem rode beneath the true cross itself, the relic gleaming faintly in the glare. Behind him the knights of the temple and the hospital formed walls of silver in prayer, banners limp from heat. They believed God would provide water. He provided fire instead. At noon the horns of Islam sounded. From every ridge came the hiss of arrows, a black rain that blotted out the light. Turkish horsemen darted in and out of range, their movements like the flicker of mirages. The Crusaders tried to charge, but the heat dragged at their armor, and their horses stumbled. Every hoofbeat raised dust that choked their lungs and blinded their eyes. Matthieu heard their coughing even from afar, a sound more pitiful than battle cries. He worked among the wounded, pouring the last drops of water onto tongues already past saving. All around him the desert roared, steel on steel, men crying out not in fury, but in disbelief. How could faith die so slowly and so loud? By mid-afternoon the valley was a bowl of smoke. The grass burned where Muslim archers had set the plain alight, the flames crawling toward the Christian camp. The heat drove men backward into their own lines. Horses reared, screaming. Wagons overturned. The relic of the cross swayed above the chaos, like a torch of judgment. Matthieu saw King Guy lift his helm to breathe, his face ashen beneath soot. Near him rode Raynald de Chatillon, eyes wild with rage and thirst, a man who had once sworn never to surrender. He would keep that promise only until the blade touched his throat. As evening came, the Crusader lines collapsed. The true cross fell, seized by soldiers shouting praises that sounded like sobs. The desert swallowed the last of the western host. When silence finally returned, it felt unnatural, as if the world itself had forgotten to exhale. Saladin dismounted beside the captured kings. He looked upon them not as enemies, but as men emptied of purpose. "Give them water," he ordered. But when the cup reached Raynald, he refused to drink. The Sultan's gaze hardened. He drew his blade, one clean stroke, and the desert received another ghost. Matthieu turned away, whispering a prayer for a soul that had never learned mercy. Have you ever watched victory walk softly through ruin, afraid to disturb the dead? That night the plain glowed with dying fires. The survivors lay bound, their armor cooling, their faith evaporating with the heat. Matthieu moved among them with bandages and silence. He found a Templar whispering fragments of a psalm and knelt beside him. "Brother," the knight gasped, "was it worth it?" The monk looked toward the horizon, where the crescent banners waved beneath a rising moon. "I think," he said, "it was never about worth, only about how long we could pretend it was." From the ridge above, Saladin watched as his army prayed in unison, the murmured verses rolling over the valley like wind through reeds. The Sultan's face was unreadable, neither pride nor joy, only inevitability. Matthieu realized that the man before him had not merely won a battle, he had ended an age. He wrote that night by the light of burning wagons. The fire of a teen consumed both faiths alike. One found triumph, the other truth, and both will fade into story. Have you ever stood at the edge of history and felt it closing behind you like a door? The dust of a teen settled slowly, drifting west across the valleys until it reached the walls of Jerusalem. There, the wind grew still, as if even the desert paused to remember. The holy city had changed hands many times in dreams, but now, for the first time in decades, it trembled in truth. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont entered the gates behind Saladin's vanguard. The sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, broken only by the creak of banners and the faraway cry of bells that had not rung in fear since the First Crusade. He remembered how chroniclers had described that earlier conquest, rivers of blood flowing through streets, swords blessed and dripping. Now, the air smelled not of iron, but of incense and dust. Saladin had forbidden looting, forbidden revenge. He had ordered water carried to the city's wells, and guards posted at its churches. Even victory, he said, must kneel before God. Inside the walls, Christian faces stared from windows, frightened, disbelieving, exhausted. Matthieu, wearing neither cross nor crescent, moved among them as translator and healer. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on these narrow streets, where prophets once walked and armies always followed. It was said that whoever held Jerusalem held heaven's favor. But standing there, he felt only the heaviness of the living. The Sultan rode through the gate of David at dawn. No trumpet sounded, only the whisper of prayer. Thousands of voices rising together, Muslim and Christian alike, mingling beneath the same light. Saladin dismounted before the church of the Holy Sepulchre and removed his sandals. The gesture spread through the crowd like a shiver. Even the dust seemed to bow. Matthieu watched him enter, not as conqueror but as pilgrim, his head bare, his sword left outside. Have you ever seen a man so powerful he no longer needed to prove it? Later, on the Temple Mount, the Sultan stood where the dome of the rock caught the sun and turned it to gold. He raised his hands to the sky. God has returned his house to peace. He said softly, "Let no man defile it with pride." Around him, his commanders listened in silence. Some had dreamed of vengeance for 40 years, yet none dared to speak, for in that moment, vengeance itself seemed small. Still, not all hearts were merciful. Among the prisoners of Aten were nobles, knights, and women who had lost husbands to this new order. They begged, pleaded, offered ransom beyond measure. Saladin granted freedom to many, refused none who could pay, and spared those who could not. When his treasurers protested, he replied, "The wealth of mercy is greater than any coin." Matthieu recorded each act in his journal, though he knew that back in Europe these stories would be doubted. The West preferred tales of cruelty. They were easier to understand. Mercy, after all, asks more of the listener than blood does. One evening, as the sun sank behind the olive hills, Matthieu walked through the quiet streets with the Sultan. They passed the church of Saint Anne, where the faint song of a Latin choir drifted from within. The voices were trembling but pure, like a flame surviving the wind. Saladin stopped to listen. "Even here," he said, "God still speaks their language." Matthieu bowed his head. "He speaks in all that endures, Majesty." "Then may he teach us to endure as well," said the Sultan. For days the city hummed with renewal, not joy, not mourning, but something deeper, something closer to healing. The muezzin's call echoed over the same rooftops that had once heard the bells of crusaders. Children played beside fountains refilled after years of siege. Merchants returned to their stalls, priests to their altars, soldiers to silence. And through it all, Matthieu felt time pause, as if Jerusalem itself was holding its breath, grateful for peace, but aware it would not last. At night, he wrote by the light of an oil lamp in a room overlooking the Mount of Olives. Outside, the city glittered faintly under the moon, white stone and shadow, cradle of every prayer and every wound. The holy city has been taken without slaughter, he wrote, and yet I fear it bleeds in ways no eye can see. The war of swords is over. The war of memory begins. Have you ever stood in a place so sacred that even silence feels like confession? When morning came, the bells and the call to prayer rose together, their notes crossing in the air like threads of gold and smoke. Matthieu stood between them, hands clasped, unsure which to follow. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. For the first time, he did not pray for victory, only for understanding. And far to the west, beyond the sea, the echo of this peace began to waken kings from uneasy dreams. The bells of Jerusalem had barely stopped ringing before their echoes reached Europe. In cloisters and courts, the story spread like wildfire wrapped in silk. The holy city had fallen, yet its conqueror showed mercy. To some it was miracle, to others humiliation, and humiliation demands redemption. In monasteries, priests read the letters aloud, voices trembling not from grief, but from disbelief. Could a Muslim be merciful? Could God favor a foreigner? The thought struck deeper than defeat. Soon the pulpits thundered once more, and men who had buried their armor began digging it up again. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, still in the holy city, heard rumors before they became proclamations. Pope Urban had died of shock upon hearing of Etienne. His successor called for vengeance with tears that looked suspiciously like fire. From England came word of a young king restless for glory, Richard of Anjou, the Lionheart. From France, another monarch, Philip Augustus, shrewd, patient, and jealous. And from Germany, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, old as legend, marching east for one last crusade. Matthieu felt the old ache returning, the dread certainty that history, like fever, was repeating itself. He watched pilgrims and soldiers arrive at the gates, bearing crosses red and white. Some kissed the stones where Saladin had prayed, whispering vengeance as if it were prayer. Others came for profit. Faith was once again a currency, and business was good. Saladin watched it unfold with the calm of a man who already understood the ending. He sat with Matthieu in the courtyard of the citadel, hands folded, the sound of the fountains blending with the distant hum of the city. They will come, he said simply, and when they come, I will greet them as I did before, with patience first and steel second. Do you fear them? Matthieu asked. The Sultan smiled faintly. Fear is for men who believe their story can end. Have you ever met someone who spoke of destiny as if it were merely another duty? When word arrived that Frederick's vast German host had drowned in the rivers of Anatolia, Saladin said nothing. He simply turned his gaze toward the sea, for he knew the real storm was crossing it. By the summer of 1190, the fleets of the west filled the horizon like a wall of moving light. The Lionheart was coming. Matthieu joined the Sultan's retinue as they rode north to Acre. The air there stank of salt and iron, and the sky was dark with gulls and smoke. The Christian armies had already landed and laid siege to the port, thousands upon thousands, their tents a second city sprawling across the coast. Saladin's banners encircled them from the inland hills, trapping besiegers and besieged alike in a circle of endless hunger. For 2 years the standoff dragged on. Faith turned to endurance, endurance to madness. Arrows darkened the sky by day, and by night the sea glowed red from burning ships. Matthieu moved between camps under flag of truce, carrying messages, water, and prayers no one could answer. He saw men on both sides starve with equal devotion. He heard both call the other infidel with the same certainty that God listened only to them. Once, he met the Lionheart himself. It happened after a parley near the walls, a meeting arranged through envoys when both sides pretended to seek peace. Richard stood tall, golden, his mail glinting like sunlight trapped in steel. His voice carried easily, bright and clear, and even those who hated him felt compelled to listen. He was the opposite of Saladin, loud where the Sultan was still, brilliant where the other was deep. Two men carved from the same stone, polished on opposite sides. When the meeting ended, Matthieu found himself close enough to see the English king remove his helm. Their eyes met for an instant. Richard nodded, a gesture not of greeting, but recognition, as if he saw in the weary monk the reflection of something he'd long forgotten doubt. Later, Matthieu returned to the Sultan's camp. "They are not demons," he said quietly. Saladin's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "No," he replied, "only men, and that is what makes them dangerous." The siege of Acre dragged on through seasons of rain and plague. At last the city fell, its walls collapsing under the combined fury of both kings. When the gates opened, thousands of Muslim prisoners emerged, expecting mercy. But patience was not Richard's gift. When negotiations faltered, he gave an order that froze even the desert wind. 3,000 captives were executed at sunset. The sand turned black with blood. That night Matthieu knelt by the shore, washing the red from his hands in the waves. Behind him, the English tents glowed like embers, and across the valley, Saladin's banners fluttered under the moon. He could no longer tell which side God watched from. Have you ever prayed knowing no one was listening? In his journal he wrote, "The kings have come again, but holiness has not. The earth remembers every drop it drinks, and still we pour." Winter passed, and the land remembered how to breathe again. From Acre the banners rose once more, heavy with salt and smoke, as King Richard led his men south along the coast. The Mediterranean glittered to their right like a blade's edge. To their left, the hills of Judea rose pale and unwelcoming. Every step carried the sound of exhaustion. They were marching toward a dream that had already cost too much. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont rode among the camp followers, tending the sick and listening to the restless murmur that runs through armies like fever. Some still believed the city could be retaken. Others whispered that perhaps God had moved his throne elsewhere. Richard rode ahead, his armor catching the light, as if sunlight obeyed him. Each dawn he prayed aloud, words that sounded half like command, half like confession. In the east, Saladin shadowed them. His scouts drifted through the dunes like ghosts, always close enough to remind, never close enough to strike. He understood what Richard did not. Jerusalem was defended not by walls, but by distance and time. If he could make the Lionheart thirst long enough, doubt would do the rest. Have you ever chased something holy until the chase itself became the sin? At Arsuf the two armies finally met, with a sea wind blew hard enough to clear the stench of war. The Frankish line moved with iron discipline, ranks of knights advancing behind walls of crossbowmen. Saladin's cavalry swirled around them, a living storm of arrows. For hours the desert sang its old hymn of steel and dust. When Richard finally gave the signal, the knights charged, a flood of iron breaking through the crescent. The shock was terrible and perfect. Even Saladin, watching from a hilltop, nodded once, as if to salute the precision of fate. That night the fields were quiet except for the groans of the dying. Matthieu moved among them, offering water and the soft mercy of listening. In the distance he saw the Lionheart walking alone beside the surf, the sea foam glowing around his boots. Kings, he thought, should never walk barefoot. They might begin to feel the earth they command. Weeks turned to months. The English king pressed inland, past burnt villages and empty wells, his army shrinking with every mile. When Jerusalem finally appeared on the horizon, a faint shimmer of white under the sun, the soldiers fell to their knees. Some wept, others laughed, but Richard did not smile. He gazed at the city a long time, then turned to his captains. "If we take it," he said, "we cannot keep it, and I will not build another grave for Europe." The words rippled through the camp like cold wind through tents. Some called it wisdom, others cowardice. Matthieu watched him that night, standing apart, eyes fixed on the faint lights that marked the walls. He looked not like a king, but like a man who had glimpsed paradise and found it smaller than memory. Across the valley, Saladin's army kept its fires low. He too watched the distant glow. Perhaps he prayed that the English king would turn back. for victory gained without slaughter is the rarest kind. In his tent he said to his brother, "There's more honor in restraint than in conquest." And yet his hands trembled when he said it. He had dreamed of this moment since youth. Now he feared what fulfillment might destroy. Have you ever stood so near your desire that stepping closer would ruin it? The truce came quietly, like a sigh. Envoys rode between the camps, bearing scrolls sealed in red wax and dust. When both kings met for the last time, they spoke not of glory but of weariness. Richard, eyes shadowed with fever, said simply, "I cannot take your city." Saladin bowed, "And I cannot drive you into the sea." They laughed softly, two men who had spent fortunes to discover their equality. On the final morning, the Lionheart rode to a hill overlooking Jerusalem. He dismounted, planted his sword in the soil, and knelt beside it. The wind carried the sound of church bells, and the muezzin's call, braided together over the city's domes. Matthieu stood behind him, uncertain whether to pray or weep. Richard whispered, "I leave this place as I found it, holy and untouchable." Then he rose, his shadow stretching long toward the sea. That night Matthieu wrote, "The kings have circled the sacred fire and refused to step inside. Perhaps this is what wisdom looks like when spoken in the language of war." Have you ever seen two enemies understand each other so completely that the rest of the world seemed small beside them? When dawn came, both armies began their retreat, one toward the coast, one toward the desert, and between them, Jerusalem stood still, shining in the morning haze, as if caught between forgiveness and memory. By late summer, the air above the coast turned soft with salt and sorrow. Jaffa's harbor, half broken by siege and storm, glimmered beneath a red sky. Ships bobbed on the waves like weary pilgrims, waiting for absolution. Here, between desert and sea, two kings prepared to end what holiness had begun. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont walked among the tents of both camps. No songs, no boasting, only the slow rhythm of carpenters rebuilding walls that would soon be abandoned again. The smell of pine tar and blood mingled oddly with the sweetness of figs. It was the scent of something ending. King Richard's health was failing. The fever had thinned his face and silvered his beard. Yet when he spoke, the fire still lived in his voice, the echo of a man who had never learned retreat. He stood on the shoreline with his captains, watching gulls drift across the crimson water. "God gives us seas," he murmured, "perhaps because the earth can no longer bear our footsteps." Across the field, Sultan Saladin received envoys beneath the silk canopy. He too looked older, his shoulders bowed not by defeat, but by the weight of patience. Around him his generals argued for one more strike, one final push to drive the Franks into the sea. He raised his hand, and the argument died. "Enough," he said. "A garden grows only after the plow has rested." That evening, under the soft gold of the setting sun, the two armies faced each other for the last time. Between them stretched an open space of trampled grass. No banners moved, no swords gleamed, only the wind. Matthieu stood there as the meeting began, two chairs set upon a carpet, two cups of water placed side by side. Richard entered first, walking slowly but proud. Saladin rose to greet him, their eyes meeting with the familiarity of men who had shared both hatred and understanding. They sat. The silence that followed was deeper than any prayer. At last the Lionheart spoke. "We have traded lives for stones, and found both heavy. Let us end this before the stones bury us." Saladin inclined his head. "The city is holy to both. Perhaps it will survive only if neither claims it." And there, in that single breath, the long madness of the Third Crusade began to fade. The Truce of Jaffa was written on parchment smooth as bone. 3 years of peace, safe passage for Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem, freedom for Muslim traders along the coast, and the promise that each would guard the other's shrines. When the seals were pressed into the wax, the sound seemed to echo through centuries, a sigh disguised as history. Have you ever witnessed two enemies make peace not out of love, but from the exhaustion of being right too long. After the signing, Richard lifted his cup. To mercy, he said. Saladin drank. To memory. They smiled faintly. Men who had learned that those two things are rarely separate. That night, torches burned along the beach as both camps feasted under the same stars. The waves carried laughter, foreign words mixing freely. Soldiers trading bread and stories instead of arrows. Matthieu walked among them, dazed by the strangeness of calm. He realized he could no longer tell which songs were sung by Franks and which by Saracens. The melodies had begun to weave together. When the moon rose high, he found the Sultan alone, gazing toward the dark sea. Majesty, Matthieu said, do you think the peace will last? Saladin smiled sadly. Nothing lasts, brother. Not even hatred. But tonight, the world sleeps without screaming. That is enough. The following dawn, Richard boarded his ship for England. From the deck, he turned once more to the coast, raising his hand in farewell. On the cliffs, Saladin stood motionless, his white robe stirring in the wind. Between them stretched the pale horizon. Not victory, not loss, only distance. Matthieu watched the sails grow small against the light, the water closing behind them like a wound finally allowed to heal. He wrote in his journal, "The sea remembers nothing of the wars fought upon its shores. It erases our footsteps faster than prayer. Perhaps that is why God made it endless." Have you ever seen peace arrive so quietly you mistook it for silence? As evening fell, Jaffa slept. The surf whispered over the sand, carrying away the last echo of trumpets. Brother Matthieu sat by the water's edge, cross in one hand, crescent coin in the other. He let both fall into the tide. The waves took them without discrimination, and for the first time in his long wandering, the monk felt something close to holy. Not triumph, not certainty, but rest. The wind off the Levant smelled of salt and memory. Richard's fleet slipped from the coast like ghosts leaving a battlefield, banners furled, decks scarred, sails creaking with fatigue. The Lionheart leaned against the rail, eyes fixed westward. Home lay somewhere beyond the endless blue, but the sea, like history, had a habit of keeping its captives. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont watched from the cliffs above Jaffa as the ships grew smaller. He stood beside Saladin, who remained silent until the last glimmer of sail vanished into the horizon. "Kings come and go," the Sultan said softly, "but their shadows stay." Then he turned and walked back toward Damascus, his white robes dissolving into the light. It was the last time Matthieu ever saw him. Weeks later, storms scattered the English fleet. Richard's ship was driven north, its hull battered, its mast splintered. He landed not in England, nor even on friendly soil, but in the cold reaches of the Danube. Disguised as a pilgrim, the world's most famous warrior tried to pass unnoticed through the ruins of Europe. But fame clings harder than any crown. A night in a tavern, a careless song in the wrong accent, and the lion was caught in a net of silence. Leopold of Austria had him seized, a king reduced to prisoner. Have you ever seen glory turn to echo in a single breath? The dungeon at Dürnstein was damp, its stones sweating winter. Richard paced the narrow cell, humming the hymns of his youth. The guard said he sang to remember sunlight. Others said he sang to drown out his own doubts. He thought of the Holy Land, the smell of cedar, the faces of men who had died following his command, and the Sultan who had spared them. What use was bravery now, where courage could not find an audience? Matthieu heard the news months later in Acre. He was tending the wounded left behind by both sides when a Venetian trader brought word. The Lionheart is chained like a common thief. The monk felt no shock, only the quiet recognition that the story was still unfolding, just slower now. The same lesson whispered differently. He closed his eyes and saw again that moment on the beach at Jaffa. Two kings saluting across the water. Even separation, it seemed, could be holy if it was done without hatred. In captivity, Richard wrote letters to his mother, to his God, to his absent allies. He confessed that the Holy Land had changed him more than he cared to admit. He spoke of Saladin, the noblest enemy I have known, who taught me the art of restraint. He spoke of the futility of walls, of the hunger for redemption that no victory could feed. And then, almost as an afterthought, he wrote, "Perhaps peace is the one kingdom I could never conquer." When Matthieu finally reached Europe years later, the Crusades had already faded into story. He visited abbeys where monks copied tales of heroism that bore little resemblance to the truth. In one illuminated manuscript, he saw Richard painted as a golden giant slaying Saracens by the dozen. The page glowed with admiration. The lies were beautiful. Matthieu smiled sadly. "Even saints," he murmured, "need better editors." Richard was ransomed at last, a fortune paid in silver, prayers, and promises. He returned to England older, his sword arm stiff, his heart heavier. The people cheered his arrival as though he had returned from paradise itself. They did not see the doubt behind his eyes, or the faint tremor in his voice when he spoke of victory. He reigned, he fought, he ruled, but never again did he speak of Jerusalem. Have you ever carried a memory so heavy it bent the crown upon your head? Matthieu visited him once in Normandy. The king recognized him at once, the weary monk from Acre who had spoken of silence and God. They walked together through the castle gardens, where the roses grew red as the banners of long-forgotten wars. Richard paused beside a fountain. "The world loves heroes," he said, "but it does not forgive them for getting old." Matthieu nodded. "And God?" Richard smiled faintly. "God forgives everything, brother. That is why we keep finding new ways to test him." When the monk departed, the king pressed a ring into his palm, gold, engraved with a single lion. "For remembrance," he said. Years later, when Matthieu lay dying in a monastery overlooking the sea, that ring still gleamed beside his bed, untarnished by time. He looked at it and whispered, "The lion sleeps, but the story walks." He closed his eyes and heard again the two voices that had shaped his life, Richard's thunder and Saladin's calm, faith and patience, noise and silence, two notes of the same unending hymn. Have you ever wondered which echoes longer, victory or mercy? The answer, he thought, must lie somewhere in between, in the pause where both men finally stopped speaking. In the spring of 1193, Damascus woke to morning bells. The city's fountains ran quietly that morning, as if the water itself were reluctant to move. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, conqueror of Jerusalem, defender of faith and mercy alike, had died. Not in battle, not by sword or poison, but by fever. The same soft enemy that had outlived every crusade. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont, now an old man himself, arrived weeks later. He walked through streets draped in green banners, stitched with verses of the Quran. Crowds filled every square, not in triumph, but in reverence. Men wept openly. Even beggars spoke his name with tenderness. The conqueror was gone, yet peace lingered like perfume after a procession. In the citadel, Matthieu was allowed to see the chamber where the Sultan had breathed his last. There was no gold, no marble, no sword, only a simple wooden bed, a single candle, and a folded cloak. Upon that cloak, the one he had worn in countless battles, lay a note written in Arabic. Its words translated for Matthieu by a scholar who could barely speak for tears. All that remains of Saladin is this. Have you ever seen a man own the world, then leave it behind so quietly? The monk touched the frayed fabric, feeling the dust of campaigns that had outlasted empires. He thought of Richard in his stone cell far to the west, and of that strange friendship born across battle lines. The two lions of faith, one golden, one green, both gone now, both leaving their armor behind like snakes shedding history. Damascus itself seemed gentler in grief. Children carried water to the poor. Soldiers lowered their swords in the marketplaces. For 40 days, muezzins added Saladin's name to their calls, as if heaven needed reminding whom it was about to receive. Matthieu listened each evening from the city walls, his heart strangely calm. It was the sound, he thought, of 2 centuries exhaling at last. He visited the Sultan's tomb before dawn, the marble still unpolished, the ground still soft from digging. No gold marked the grave, only a wooden chest placed beside it, half open. Inside, the scribe whispered, were the 3 dinars Saladin had left at death. 3 coins from a man who had ruled half the world. Matthieu knelt, tracing the name carved upon the stone. It said nothing of victories, nor the reconquest of Jerusalem. Only, here lies one who believed in mercy. The monk bowed his head and prayed in Latin, the words mingling with Arabic murmurs around him, the 2 prayers meeting like waves in the same tide. Across the city, poets began composing elegies. One line, repeated in every bazaar, said, "He built an empire upon sand, and the sand obeyed him because he walked softly." Matthieu carried that phrase in his heart for years. He wrote it later in his own hand, adding beneath it, "And those who fought him learned silence." Have you ever noticed how death can make rivals into reflections? The days after the funeral felt like the world was holding its breath. Courtiers argued over succession. Generals measured their loyalty in silence. But the people, the farmers, the traders, the women who swept the mosque steps, they remembered something pure. They spoke of the Sultan's kindness, how he spared prisoners, how he forgave even the men who once swore to kill him. No chronicler could erase that. History may belong to victors, Matthieu thought, but eternity belongs to the merciful. When he finally left Damascus, he took nothing with him. No relics, no coins, not even a handful of the earth from Saladin's grave. He said to his escort, "The world has enough trophies. What we lack are witnesses." And he walked south toward Acre, then west toward the sea, following the same pilgrim paths that had first brought him east half a lifetime ago. On the ship home, he opened his journal and wrote, "The Sultan is gone. The lion sleeps. Yet the wind between their graves hums the same tune. It is the sound of men who fought for heaven and discovered they had been standing in it all along." That night, as the waves rocked the vessel, Matthieu dreamed of the 2 kings. They stood together on the hills above Jerusalem, watching the city glow beneath moonlight. Neither spoke. They simply listened to bells, to prayer, to the faint heartbeat of a world too tired for war. Have you ever dreamed of enemies who no longer need forgiveness? When Matthieu awoke, the horizon was gray and endless. Europe awaited colder, louder, filled with men eager to turn memory into legend. He sighed and whispered into the wind, "Let them sing of swords. I will remember the silences." The ship reached Marseilles beneath a sky the color of pewter. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont stepped onto the pier with a cane and a silence that no harbor noise could pierce. Children ran shouting between the barrels of wine and spice, and the air smelled of trade, the new religion of Europe. He had crossed half the world to return to a continent that seemed younger and hungrier than when he left it. On the road north, he passed towns rebuilding their churches with stone from the very castles abandoned to the east. Everywhere he looked, the cross had changed shape. It was carved on coins, woven into banners, sold in markets. The merchants called them relics. Matthieu called them souvenirs. At night in monasteries he heard pilgrims boasting of miracles they had never seen, and knights telling stories of Jerusalem as though it were a dream they had personally conquered. He never corrected them. He only whispered, "Dreams are safest when they stay dreams." When he reached Paris, winter had begun. Snow fell like ash over the city roofs. Inside Notre Dame, choirs practiced hymns written to honor crusaders who had never returned. Matthieu listened to the pure voices rise through the vaults, and thought of the guttural prayers that once echoed across the stones of Acre. Both reached heaven, he supposed, though heaven might have stopped listening. In the royal court he was received politely, as relic rather than witness. King Philip Augustus, older now, asked whether the tales of Saladin's generosity were true. Matthieu nodded. The king frowned. "Strange," he said. "How mercy can conquer men as surely as armies." Then he changed the subject to taxes. Have you ever watched faith turn into ceremony, and ceremony into business? The monk visited the scriptorium of St. Denis, where scholars illuminated new chronicles of the Holy Wars. He stood behind a young scribe painting Richard the Lionheart with a halo and a sword that burned like fire. On the facing page, Saladin knelt in admiration, rendered small and golden. Matthieu touched the margin with one finger. The truth was quieter, he said. The scribe looked up, confused. Then no one would read it, Father. He walked out into the cold and laughed softly, a sound like breaking ice. Truth, it seemed, had become a poor investment. Through the next years, he wandered among abbeys, giving sermons no one requested. He spoke of mercy, of fatigue, of the holiness of restraint. Most listeners shifted in their seats. They preferred victories. One abbot told him kindly, "Brother, you speak as if God were tired." Matthieu replied, "Perhaps he is." He spent his last summer by the sea at Mont Saint-Michel. From his cell, he could watch the tide sweep across the flats, erasing every footprint left by pilgrims. That, he thought, was how history worked. Each generation believed it was building monuments. The ocean believed otherwise. One evening, a young novice brought him a letter sealed with red wax, a copy of a papal bull calling for yet another crusade. Matthieu smiled wearily. "So the wheel turns," he said. He wrote a reply he never sent. "Tell them the road to Jerusalem grows longer each time they march. It begins now at their own doorstep." Then he folded the parchment and placed it beneath his pillow. As autumn returned, his strength failed. He spent his final days dictating fragments of memory to a patient brother from Normandy. "Write this," Matthieu whispered, "that we may remember not how the cities fell, but how the silence afterward felt like mercy." When he died, they found by his bed a ring engraved with a lion and a scrap of parchment bearing a single line. "Two kings taught me that victory is smaller than forgiveness." The monks buried him facing east, toward lands he would never see again. At dawn, the tide came in and covered the path to the mainland, isolating the abbey like an island of memory. The sea murmured against the stones, gulls wheeled overhead, and somewhere in that gray expanse of water and wind, Matthieu's story folded itself into the greater quiet he had always sought. Have you ever heard the sound of a world forgetting you, and felt grateful? By dusk, only the tide remained, a soft pulse beneath the horizon, eternal and indifferent. It washed over the sand, whispering to the bones of kings and monks alike. All thrones are hollow. Only mercy endures. The year was 1375. Rain fell on Paris like a slow confession, washing soot from the gargoyles of Notre Dame. In the library of St. Denis, a young scholar named Etienne de Mirabeau turned the brittle pages of a manuscript no one had touched in 100 years. Its cover was plain calfskin. The ink faded to the color of dried blood. Inside, in a script patient and uneven, he read the name, Matthieu de Clairmont, brother of the Order of Saint Benedict. The title below it, Chronicle of Dust and Fire. Etienne frowned. He had never heard of this monk. He had been searching for new sources on the Crusades. Yet this was no military record. The first line spoke not of kings, but of silence, not of triumph, but of understanding. He read aloud to himself, "Mercy is the only victory that never requires rebuilding." Have you ever stumbled upon a voice from another age and felt it speaking directly to you? The words drew him deeper. Matthieu's handwriting wavered like an old man's breath, but his sentences glowed with strange calm. Etienne read of Saladin's cloak folded at his deathbed, of Richard's ring, of ships disappearing westward under gray skies. These were no chronicles of conquest. They were letters to the soul. He spent nights in the cloistered library by candlelight, the cold wax dripping down onto the margin where the old monk's fingerprints still pressed faintly into the parchment. Sometimes he fancied he could smell salt from the eastern seas, or hear faint bells from Jerusalem carried on the wind through broken glass windows. The past was not dead, merely asleep, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Outside the abbey walls, Europe was forgetting. The 100 years war burned the countryside. Popes quarreled from rival thrones. Knights still marched under the cross. but their wars were for gold, not God. Etienne realized that the same fever which had driven men east now drove them against each other. The crusade had come home. He returned to the manuscript each evening, as one might visit a confessor. Matthieu's voice became his teacher, his shadow. He wrote marginal notes in Latin, veritas in silentio, truth in silence. He began to dream of the monk, an old man by the sea, writing by candlelight, his words floating across centuries like small boats that somehow reached this new shore. Have you ever felt that history itself was testing whether you still believed in it? One night, as rain lashed the windows, Etienne found a page half burned, the ink smudged but legible enough to reveal a final passage. If anyone finds these words, know that I did not seek to record victory, but its absence. For absence teaches more kindly than triumph ever could. He sat back, the candle flickering. All his teachers had told him history was built on power, on kings and empires. But here was a voice whispering that the truest history was humility. He realized, with a tremor, that he was holding the last testament of a man who had watched the end of the world and forgiven it. He copied every page, working for weeks. When his abbot discovered what he was doing, he called Matthieu's writing dangerous softness. The church, he said, had no use for mournful monks. Etienne bowed, hid the pages in his cloak, and left St. Denis that night under a sky full of thunder. He wandered for years, teaching in small towns, always carrying the manuscript. In taverns, he told travelers stories of the two kings, how one ruled by the sword, the other by mercy, and how both were buried by time, yet not by memory. Some laughed, others listened in silence. A few wept without knowing why. Eventually he reached the coast of Brittany. There, in a monastery overlooking the gray Atlantic, he entrusted Matthieu's book to the brothers, asking only that it be read when men grow tired of glory. Then he vanished into the western mists, his name dissolving into rumor. Centuries later, the manuscript would resurface again, not in a palace, but in a sailor's chest, wrapped in linen to protect it from salt. Its first line still legible. Mercy is the only victory that never requires rebuilding. Have you ever realized that forgotten words can outlive every empire? When the modern scholars of Paris cataloged the find, they dismissed it as pious fiction, an odd curiosity from the age of faith. But a few, the quiet ones, the ones who read at night, felt something stir behind the ink. It was not history they heard. It was a heartbeat. It was the year 2025, though the air in the old university library smelled older than centuries. Dust hung in the sunlight, like scripture undone. Dr. Eleanor Reyes, historian of forgotten wars, turned the cracked leather of a small folio she had found in a neglected cabinet marked Miscellanea Monastica. The pages whispered when opened, brittle, brown, almost transparent. Across the first leaf ran a name that no catalog contained. Brother Matthieu de Clairmont. Beneath it, faintly inked, the title, Chronicle of Dust and Fire. Eleanor read the first line aloud, the sound trembling through the stillness. Mercy is the only victory that never requires rebuilding. Something in the room seemed to listen back. She read for hours, tracing the monk's voice through empires and oceans. Richard the Lionheart rose from the dust. Saladin rode again through the cedar hills. Kings prayed, bled, and slept. Faith burned, cooled, and turned to memory. And through it all, one quiet man walked beside them, recording not their triumphs, but their silences. Have you ever felt a stranger from the past take your hand? Outside, students hurried between neon screens and deadlines. Inside, time folded. Eleanor forgot the hum of the modern world, hearing instead the slow scratch of a quill, the murmur of waves against a monastery wall, the low chant of monks at vespers. It felt less like reading than remembering. She paused on a passage written in 1291. When the last tower fell, the wind carried the dust westward. I pray that somewhere it will settle in gentler hearts. Her throat tightened. She realized that dust, those same particles of ground stone and prayer, might indeed have crossed the sea, might have settled infinitesimally into the very mortar of this building. The thought felt like a blessing that had taken 700 years to arrive. She carried the manuscript home, careful as though it were alive. That night, while rain swept the city, she lit a candle and read until dawn. Matthieu's last pages spoke of two kings sleeping in peace, of swords turned to rust, of the sea washing all names clean. The ink faded mid-sentence, as if the writer had finally set the pen down and simply listened. Have you ever wanted to meet someone you could only find in words? Eleanor closed the book and stared at the flame. She thought of her own world, its noise, its divided faiths, its hunger to be right instead of good. The same wars, she realized, only with brighter banners. And she wondered, what if Brother Matthieu had not been writing for his time at all? What if he had been writing for hers? At sunrise, she walked to the river. The city was silvered in mist. She opened the folio once more, feeling the cool wind turn the pages as though invisible fingers guided them. Then quietly, she read aloud. Two kings taught me that victory is smaller than forgiveness. The words drifted across the water. For a moment, the ripples seemed to shimmer with color, gold and green, the hues of two banners that once opposed each other beneath the same sun. Then the light dissolved, and the river carried the sound away toward the sea. When she returned the manuscript to the archive, she added a single note on the inside cover. Read this when men grow tired of glory. Exactly what Etienne de Mirabeau had written centuries before. Have you ever realized that stories do not end? They rest until we are ready for them. Years later, visitors to the library would pause before that same glass case, seeing only a faded book and a small scrap of paper beside it. Few read the inscription. Fewer still felt the quiet pulse behind the ink. But sometimes, late at night, when the janitors had gone and the motion lights had dimmed, the pages stirred slightly, as if breathing. A faint scent of salt rose in the air, and a whisper, barely audible, seemed to cross the room. Mercy endures, and thus the circle closes, from the thunder of Clairmont to the whisper of a modern library, from swords to pages, from dust to light. Brother Matthieu's chronicle continues, waiting for the next weary heart to open it. Have you ever listened closely enough to hear history forgive itself?